Okay, so where we left off on Wednesday is we started to bring in different pictures, different resources, and we started to compose them into a shot. So right now I showed how to bring them in, how to scale them. We can also use that same transform tool to rotate these images. And so what I have is a palette of things, and there's probably a couple more things that I want to bring in. So when I start to think about a collage, there's a couple of important things to keep in mind in terms of what a collage is and what it does. So one of the things that that you want to be aware of is there's different techniques for different types of ideas. So a collage is meant to be non-seamless. It's meant to be representative of showing parts and pieces. So you don't want it to be super slick, right? And you want to start to understand what the relationship is from the images that you're creating to the borders that you're creating, okay? So one of the things that I think works really well is to make sure that the parts and pieces, the borders, the edges around the image actually don't go all the way to the edge, to the bleed, and that they stay kind of jagged and piecemeal and composed in terms of parts and pieces. So one of the things you'll notice is that I had this up here and it was up to the top, and I'll start to bring this down, and I want to make sure that I leave these edges so that they're moving back and forth, okay? And that's just a personal preference in terms of the idea of collage, okay? Now, we can use a lot of the very same techniques to be much more sophisticated, and like the Alex Hogreef tutorial that I just showed, he has a whole seamless image, and it's about actually creating a rendered image, a sophisticated rendered image. So details about seamlessness and blending and edges and things like that become much more important to pay attention to craft and detail. This has craft and detail, but part of that craft is actually maintaining and showing those edges, okay, and showing the parts and the pieces of a collage, okay, so that each piece keeps its own identity. All right, so what we're going to get into here is we've got some of the parts and pieces, and so one of the things I start to think about when I think about the spirit collage is what is the project trying to do? So in this case, my interpretation of Snow White as piece is really like a picture frame. It's really trying to frame an image in my mind. You might have a different interpretation of it, but the idea of this metal box and this seating configuration and this big pane of glass out into the landscape as a viewing platform for reindeer, to me, starts to talk about framing and picture framing. So some of the things I would start to do here is I have a collection of things. I have a collection of the landscape, and so I want to start to convey that idea of framing for me, okay, in this spirit collage. So one of the things I'm going to do is for this frame, this reindeer, it starts to become too big, and I want to start to show depth into the landscape. So by using Control-T or Command-T, I'm doing the free transform tool, and I'm going to shrink this down, and I'm also going to hold the Shift key down so that I keep it in proportion. So I'm starting to think about how I'm composing the page. There's another important thing to think about when you are putting this together is composition. So who's taken art classes here? So you know what I mean when I say composition, right? Okay. So composition, for those that don't know, is how you start to balance the images in the frame, okay? And how you start to give weight and move a person's eye through the image. So some of the most basic types of imagery start to when we start to think about something is the most basic is, okay, let's put something in the center of the screen, like our reindeer, we'll center them, and we start to think about symmetry and things like that. That's one compositional tool, but it's usually not the most interesting compositional tool. Okay, so I like to think about things in terms of rule of thirds when we're putting together this composition. So I am going to show you a couple of things that are helpful. So let's go up to View, and I'm going to turn on the rulers. And this will put rulers around the edges. And with this rulers, it allows me to start to build out and draw out some guidelines for composition. So if I put my cursor over the ruler and click down and drag and hold it down, I can drag out this ruler. And this will start to give me a guideline. And I'm going to drag out a couple of these because I want to start to break up this frame into thirds. Now, I don't normally do this explicitly. I'm doing this for demonstration, but in my mind, I am trying to create, I will start to segment an image into 9 different boxes using this rule of thirds. And so I'm just going to draw these guides out here to help explain my idea. But normally I don't put them in here when I'm talking about it. But these are great if you have, you're composing an image or board. Yeah.
If you don't see those rulers, you press Control R or Command R from the Mac, and it'll pop up.
That's another. Okay, so Command R and Control R. And so now we have these grids. So what we have is what we would call the next compositional tool is the rule of thirds. Who's heard of the rule of thirds? Oh, awesome. Most of you. Great. Perfect. So that is just to reiterate for those who haven't heard about it is if you start to compose the image into areas of thirds, you can start to create a dynamic image. So instead of having the reindeer right in the middle, I am going to start to move him over to the right and start to compose this line here. And I'm going to purposely try to make sure that this open center starts to stay kind of open. The other thing you'll notice here is that down in the bottom, that this starts to, with the rocks in the composition, starts to lead the eye to the reindeer. So part of this composition and part of rendering and part of composing images and representation, and this also goes for your presentation boards and your portfolio, is you always want to be very conscious about controlling the viewer's eye, right? You get to do that. And you do that through your composition of how you place things on the board, what kind of alignments that you create from one element to another, what kind of relationships, how close they are, how far apart they are. The colors that you use can help guide somebody through, the contrast that you do. So keep in mind that as you're composing your images and every single image and even diagrams, anything that you are creating visually. This also goes for when you're developing, the same kind of rules can be applied for when you're developing floor plans and elevations and designing your buildings. Those same compositional techniques can be a very helpful tool. Okay, so we have kind of this basis, and I'm starting to understand how I want this to be framed. And so now my idea here is that I'm going to start to create some sort of frame here. And I'm going to do it in terms of making sure that the frame is also very explicit of being a frame. Okay? So I've got this bounding box here which kind of starts to outline my idea of where I'm going to start to compose. I'm going to let stuff bleed outside of this frame. so that I can understand that the building is a frame and it's an object that's that the landscape goes beyond it. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to open up, go back to my materials file. And I'm going to load up a series of things. This Corten steel, the boat. And what I'm doing is I'm holding down Command or Control as I click to select. I'm just going to open all of those in one go. And so then I'm going to go over here to this Corten steel. I like this one a little bit better. So I am going to do Command or Control A and select all of it, and then Command or Control C, which is copy. You can also right click and layer via copy. And then I'm going to go in here and we'll just go edit, paste. So you'll notice that it's come in as its own layer. I'm going to save it as Corten. Just rename the layer just so I keep things organized. And you'll notice that that because I started to erase that foreground layer, this edge starts to bleed through, which starts to have its own kind of interesting effect. But I want to start to create this frame. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to do a couple things. I'm going to know that I have four edges, four sides of this box. So I am going to click on this layer over here. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to choose to duplicate the layer. So because I know that I'm going to need this kind of Corten copy, or this Corten steel. I want to keep a kind of virgin example of it, and then this way I can copy and paste and do some other things with it. So I'm going to basically need four of these, and I'm going to use our old technique of using Alt or Option and hold down and left click and copy. And I'm just going to make a few copies of my four sides of the box. Okay. And then I'm going to basically turn off the so I'm working on the single Corten, the first copy. Okay, now I want to edit this, but I want to start to create this idea that there's a dimensionality to this piece. So one of the ways we commit depth and some dimensionality to this not only is through layering. We can also start to think about diffusion and contrast. So as things get further away, they get more foggy or diffused, and there's not as much contrast between them. And we also can use the most obvious tool, which is perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm here up in the edit. I'm going to go down to transform, and I'm going to go to distort. And I showed you this tool a little bit the last time. But now what I want to do is start to distort this material in a way that starts to give me some depth. thinking that I'm going to have this frame. Okay, so that looks good for the moment. And I'm going to go back over here and start to think, well, maybe I want all of this stuff in front of that. So maybe I want to take this foreground layer and drag it down so that my frame jumps over the top of it. Okay, so that looks good for me. So now I'll turn on this next layer, select that, and I'm going to use the same tool, Edit, Transform, and I'm going to just start to distort this too. But I'm going to start to pay attention to how this goes together. I'm going to do it quickly and then I'll go in and refine it and touch it up. Make sure that it's all nice and crisp. Oops. So this distort tool is really useful even after you've done just simple renderings. Like you could have a very simple 3D model and you don't want to spend all the time applying textures in a 3D rendering scenario because sometimes that can be really time consuming to get all of the U and V coordinates and the mapping coordinates correctly. Sometimes it's just easier to do a flat render that has some light and shadow to it and then just bring it into Photoshop and apply some textures in here, and you can get some really good spectacular results without having to mess around too much. Okay, so we've got that. Let's open up the next layer. Just do the same thing. So when I don't grab the edge and I grab into the middle, it's grabbing and moving the whole thing. So I can move this whole thing over. I'm just going to guesstimate and fix later. And when I'm done, I'm just hitting enter to lock it back into place. Okay, now we'll do our last piece. Oops. So I grab the middle one, the middle anchor, because that can grab the whole side. So I can start to use that to bring it to the whole edge. And then I can take this piece and then fine tune it. And so to get this fixed, I'm going to have to go back to the previous piece. So I'll click on that layer. After I hit enter and lock this one down, I'll go back to the previous layer that I was just on and use the same tool again. Edit, transform, distort. And I'm just going to go and fix this. I'm going to drag this up till it's close. Okay, so we've got a basic frame. I would probably come back and tweak this a little bit here, this edge, but I'm not going to mess around with that right now. The idea is to get the to work quickly to get your idea down, because sometimes as you're putting this together, your idea will change. You'll find some new interesting pieces, and you'll want to do something a little bit different. Okay, so we've got the frame. So I'm going to show you another organizational tool. So let's go over to our layer palettes and let's go down to the bottom. And if you go down to the bottom, you can there's a little file folder icon right down here that says create new group. So we're going to create a group. Okay, so we've got our group. Now and we can double click on that and rename it. I'm going to call this our frame. And then I'm going to select all of my Corten pieces, holding the Shift key down. And then I'm going to left click and hold it and drag that into the frame. So now I have it in my frame, and I can turn it all on and off in one go. So that'll allow me to kind of keep this nice and clean. Okay, so we've got the frame, and so the next piece is I want to start to think about the relationship of that frame. So in the reindeer, so I'm thinking I'm going back and looking at that, and I think I want to move the reindeer again. So I'm just going to use the move tool, which is up here. And we can also, once we have that frame selected, so the only thing on this layer is the reindeer, I can use my arrow keys on the keyboard to actually move this thing in and out. So I'm starting to think that again, even within my frame, I'm starting to think about it in terms of rules of third within the frame as well as rules of third outside of the frame. And I'm starting to decide that this reindeer, actually, I like it how it breaks on inside and outside of the frame. So I want to go ahead and make that bigger, make that more explicit. And I actually like how the antlers actually don't go into the frame, because what that does is that starts to create a pocket in which it forces your eye back around into it. So I'm going to just keep it like that for now. Maybe move up the head just a little bit, even more. Okay. Alright, so now I want to start to think about the wood and the seating and the carving. And I don't know quite what I want to do with that yet. But this seems to me to be where I want to start. So I'm going to take this lasso tool, and I'm just going to start to cut out some of this image. And you'll notice that for a final piece, I would do this a little bit cleaner, but I'm going to kind of do a hack job on this for right now. Okay, I just hit enter to copy all of this. So now I'm going to copy, Command C or Control C, go back in here, and you can go Control V or just edit paste. Name it. Now it's behind my frame, but really what I want this to be is in front of my frame, because this is on our side. The wood is where we interact with it. So I'm going to drag it in front of this frame. I'm using Command or Control T to bring up our transform tool again. And then I'm just going to scale this down a little ways. Starting to think about how I want to use this. I think what I want to do is get a little funky with it. Distort this a little bit. But not too much. Okay, hit enter, that'll get us started. And I think what I want to do is start to, rather than, because this is important because it has some cultural identity. So again, I'm going to Control A, Control C, which is, or Command C, copy it, bring it in, and I am going to paste it. Command T again to start to shrink it. And I'm holding the Shift key down so that I have control that it doesn't distort it too much. And then I'm going to decide, I'm deciding right now that I want to make this thing part of our, part of the perspective. So I want to go to Edit, Transform, Distort. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm looking at the perspective that I set out. This is really roughshod, but the perspective lines, and trying to make sure that I have some semblance of some family resemblance between the perspectives. It can be a little off, but if you keep it pretty close, then we'll have it. So one of the things I'm thinking is that now I'm starting to think conceptually about wood to carving, and starting to think about conceptually the culture and the amount of technique that it starts to take. So what I want to do is start to create this series of conceptual ideas that go from timber here to, now I think I'm going to put the boat somewhere in between, to carving, so that we have this discussion, this idea that as it gets closer to us, it becomes more refined and more sophisticated, the use of wood. So that's one of these things where you start to think conceptually about what's happening in the project itself, and where you start to interpret what's happening, and then start to visually make that connection. So we'll go back to the Viking boat, and I'm going to use the lasso tool because I don't want all of this other stuff. And I'm just going to start selecting here. Again, I'm doing this really quickly. For a final piece, I would encourage you to be much more careful. Looks like I got a little mess up there, so I'm going to go back to my lasso tool, hold my shift key down to add this little portion that I missed. Okay, copy, Control C. And I want it to be in between this layer and the wood layer, so I'm going to select this one because it's going to paste on top of that. So edit, paste. Control T to scale it. That's not going to work very well. Let's see. Thought we had a little bit larger image size. Oh, that's not going to work. Okay, so this was not looking at the image size. So as you can see, what happens here is if I don't have the right image size, see how it comes in super small. So that is, I'm going to have to either find another Viking boat image or scrap that idea. So for now, because we don't have time to go look at or another image, I'm going to scrap that idea. And then go back to refining this idea here, that there's this merging, this blending between the two. Okay. So another technique on this editing piece is if we go to Edit and we go to Puppet Warp, it'll bring up a series of triangulations that start to describe the frame. I'm going to zoom in here. Oh. And so I can select different pieces on this. And I can start to distort this picture. Around this wood. As you can tell, this is processor intensive. So again, what I'm doing along this edge is I'm trying to create a dialogue about this edge and about, in a way, what I'm trying to get across here in my mind. The concept that I'm trying to convey is that this wood is malleable, that it has a flexibility or a malleability that allows us to kind of create and distort it the way we want. So once I have that done, I'm going to hit enter. It's going to go through and process and create that. And then what I'm going to do, just for, I'm going to experiment, I'm going to duplicate a layer, duplicate that layer again. And I'm going to turn off the original because I want to be able to go back to this. So I want to mess around with this edge and that. So anytime that you want to experiment, just copy and create a new layer and experiment with it. Okay, what I'm going to work on here is work on this edge and work on blending these two edges together. So if I look at and change the opacity of the carving layer, I have a bunch of wood underneath there still. So what I'm going to do is put this, for the time being, right around 70% so I can kind of see where the wood is underneath it. And then I'm going to use this very similar technique to what we had last time, or what we did yesterday, where I went over and I picked the eraser tool over here. You can press E to get the eraser tool, but you select that eraser tool, and we have a brush, and right now it's just a regular kind of brush, but I want this, I'm just going to select this round, soft round edge because I'm going to start to blend between the two of them. I'm going to use, you can use the size to make it smaller, or you can use the brackets like we talked about yesterday to be about that size. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to start to erase this edge on this layer. I've turned down my opacity so it's around 17%, so I have to go over it a few times. I think Eric and Byron were also suggesting that you guys might consider bringing mice, use a mouse. Sometimes using the trackpad is a little bit more difficult. Okay, I'm going to increase the opacity here just to see what's happening. To speed things up, I'm going to turn up the opacity just a little bit. Yeah. Go. Right click on the eraser. Yeah. You tell them about it. I don't know what you're talking about.
So with this right click, so depending if your eraser is too big or too small, instead of going to the top part, the room is adjusting is go back to brush you selected with the eraser as well as the sides. You can change the pixel size of the eraser. And for that size spectrum, you can plug it in. And then right click. You see how the eraser's like changed? So if you need to do some erasing that's smaller than just the baby section, it's a lot faster than having to keep going back and forth.
Yeah, and then you can do it also on the fly using the bracket tools. You can change the size of the brush by using the bracket buttons, which is right next to the P, just to the two that are right next to, yeah, so either one of those. So now I'm going to switch over to the wood because I don't like this edge right here, so I want to go in here and soften and bleed that edge a little bit so it looks a little strange. So using the same technique, just erasing it a little bit. You can do some other things too, which I think you might be interested to look at. If we go, click the button up at the top here to the brush, we can change some of the techniques, but we have a tab up here. It says brush presets, and there's some different brushes here that we can use for techniques. So these two right here, these two buttons, 112, 134, those two, those are really great for the grass, doing grass edges and kind of softening up, and so vegetation starts to look a little bit better. What I'm going to look for is something that has a little bit of texture to it. I'll say let's do that one. Dry brush. turn down the opacity a little bit. Okay, so these are the basic kind of techniques, and so now I have this conceptual idea that we're going from wood, or I'm trying to convey it's going from wood to carving. We've used the distortion tool, we've used the brush tools. You can go through and experiment with these different brush tools. Now, when I was to go back and fix this a little bit more, I would probably go back to that original image and start to bring back in the mountains, because there's mountains into this landscape that I would want. Norway also has a tons of lakes, so these little spaces here where these gaps start to happen, I would probably clean up this edge here around this edge. But let's, I'm going to call it good for today, because it starts to convey what I'm looking for in general, is this kind of conceptual piece that isn't super explicit, but it gets the point across of what your interpretation of this is. So now let's talk a little bit about saving these things and what formats and what's available to us. So if we go to File and Save As, the first thing it's going to do is pop up as a Photoshop document. So a Photoshop document is what you generally want to save your working files under, because that will keep all of your layer information, all of your color adjustment information, all of these things together as one piece, and so you can go back and deconstruct or change or modify. But those file sizes are generally larger, so just keep in mind of that. So this is your working document. You generally want to save it as a PSD, but you don't want to save the final image as a PSD that you're going to work with in Illustrator or InDesign or some of these other pieces. Those you probably want to save as a JPEG or a PNG file. So first I'm going to save this. It's going to ask me if I want to replace it. Yeah, sure, I do. So maximize compatibility. By default, I generally keep it maximized. So if I want to share it with somebody, or I want to use a different version or something like that, it just makes sure that that is more likely to happen. Photoshop is generally not as problematic as far as the Photoshop file, PSD file, with other versions, but InDesign definitely has some issues with file versions that we'll get into. So just keep in mind, maximum compatibility is always good. So I go and save that, make sure that that's all saved. Now I can start to do a couple of things. One, I can go export. So if I had some paths drawn, I could send those to Illustrator. If you're making some video or something, that's one thing. But generally, if you just do Save As again, oh, it's being saved in the background. Okay. My computer is super slow today. Okay, so now if we go down here, we can click Save as a Copy, which is good. And then we can pop in here and say, okay, look at all of these different versions. So I'm just going to go through these different versions real quickly so you know what they are. BMP is a bitmap file, and it saves pixels, and it's an older format, and so there's generally a very little compression, and so it can lead to some big file sizes. CompuServe GIF, the GIF is probably, you guys are all know what the animated GIFs and all that other stuff. Again, this is some issues with this is that you have to tell it a specific color range that it's going to start to create. You know, generally a lot of the GIFs that you see that are animated go down to 256 colors rather than 16 million colors. So generally you don't save in that. DICOM actually is a new one. I don't know what that one is actually. Photoshop EPS. Photoshop EPS stands for Encapsulated PostScript File, and it is an old version of how we talk to printers. So it'll take things that are and try to make them vector if they're vector. So that's one of the things. IFF format is another older legacy format for bitmap saving. Generally no compression, very large. JPEG and JPEG 2000, and you guys are probably familiar with, in which the JPEGs are a compressed file. Almost all of your phones will save as a JPEG because it does a very good job of keeping quality to file size, making that drop off, that tug of war between the two pretty well. It generally makes, all of these were JPEGs, all of these texture images that I use. JPEG with rendering out 3D images, keeping both images for a 3D composite in the same file but separated so that it understands that. Multi-picture format is a new one I actually don't know. PCX is another new one I don't know. Photoshop PDF, that will create a PDF file. Generally though, it doesn't recognize layers. So like if I was to export this here, it would try to merge all of those layers into one. So if you brought it into Illustrator, for instance, thinking you were going to edit those different layers as images, you wouldn't be able to do that. Photoshop RAW. RAW is an uncompressed file format, and so it doesn't take any compression, so the file size is quite large. Pixar is another file format, raster. Pixar is from a rendering firm. You guys are all probably familiar with Pixar. PNG is the other one that you'll probably, I use PNG a lot because it has the compression like JPEG. It does a very good job of that, but it also keeps all the alpha channels. So everything that is checkerboarded around here, it will keep that information as being transparent. So when we import that into another file or another rendering, it will be cognizant of that, and that otherwise, if we do this as a JPEG, all of that transparent area will become white. Okay, so just keep in mind of that. So for now, I'm going to choose JPEG or a PNG. Now there's some other options down here as far as embed color profile. So what this is good, it's always good to kind of keep that checked, make sure that that's checked, because what it will do is it'll take the color information, the range that you created it in, and transfer that, embed that into the file. So when you open it in another program, it knows what color space you were working in, so that there's less translation between colors, and you'll keep your colors more accurate. So if we, it gives us some choices here. So if we want the smallest file size, it will take a little time to compress. The interlaced and non-interlaced, generally I pick none. Basically what that does is interlacing means that in some formats it will take the information for every other line. So interlacing started when the web was really slow, and we had to, you want to get an image there, but you didn't want to wait for the whole image. So what it would do is it would send the odd lines first and then the even lines. So you would start to get an image quickly and then fill it back in. Generally, we don't have to worry about that anymore, so just keep it as at none is probably a good bet. Okay, so that's saved. The other thing I want to mention to you is that you want to save periodically your work. Try to get in the habit of saving every 10 or 15 minutes as you work, especially if you're starting to work on really large size files or doing complicated things, because there's nothing worse than working for like 2 hours on the image and then all of a sudden your computer loses power or it crashes and you've lost the image. That, I can't even tell you how many times that's happened to me. So, oops. Automatically do that in the background. It has an autosave function, so that's not as critical. But Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign, InDesign does have some limited autosave capability, so that one's actually pretty nice. Okay, so as we've kind of created this image, there's a couple of things I wanted to go over before we end class for today. And that is to talk a little bit about some adjustments that we can make to the file, okay? And we can do this on a per layer basis, or we can do it as a full image basis. And we can also do it per layer by meaning I could just select this layer here and selectively change just that layer, or I can do it for the whole picture. But if we go down to the bottom of this tab here, now that we've saved it, you'll see this kind of half moon or half full on off thing. I don't know how to describe it, this little circle. Create new fill or adjustment layer. So if we click on that, it brings up this menu. So we could create a layer that just is filled with a color, which is really great for that overlay technique. So we could fill it with 50% gray, and then we can adjust some tones that way. We could fill it with a gradient. We'll get into that a little bit later when we get into compositing a little bit more, when we get to rendering. So you could create a gradient that might be from cool colors to warm colors that we might overlay for the whole image to start to give this nice tone, color tone over the top of it. We can insert some patterns. I almost never use that. Have you guys ever used that? No. But here's some, these are the ones that we'll use a lot, which are brightness and contrast, levels, curves, and exposure. So brightness and contrast is pretty obvious of what it's going to do. But the great thing about doing it here, there's two ways you can do it. When we do it here, we can go back and adjust it. So we can put in a layer, we can do some adjustments, work on it a little bit more, change our mind, and go back. We can also do a similar operation by going up to the top and going Image, Adjustments, and you'll see that we have the same pieces. The problem with doing it up here is it's a one-time operation and it changes your image immediately, and you can't go back other than going back, doing the undo, redo scenario. So generally, whenever I do picture adjustments, I always create an adjustment layer. So let's just open this up a little bit. So let's make a brightness and adjustment, a contrast layer. And you'll see here that it creates a layer over the top, and then it brings up this this piece here. So I'm going to move over just a tad. So here I can adjust the brightness, and you can see how it's starting to change the color. Okay. Or I can change the contrast, and you can see how it's starting to make a very big difference between the light and dark areas and actually saturating this piece. Or if we can turn it down, you can see that it's really starting to suppress the dynamic range of the two. Brightness and contrast is good for fine-tuning, but it's generally not one that I use the first time. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep that, and I'm going to turn that off. Now, if I want to go back, now that it's here in this adjustment layer, I can click on this, double click on it, and it brings back up that adjustment layer. So if I want to go back and fine tune it again, I can do that. So let's make another layer. This one you will use a lot. This is levels. Okay, so levels, what levels do, this thing here is called a histogram. And so here on this edge we can show, this tells us the black in the area and the amount of white in the picture. Okay? So, and then this is where the middle point. And so what this is a way of doing is showing you how much of a particular type of information. So how much dark information, how much black information, and how much light or white information is in the image. And you can see that it's done in a chart. So here we have a bunch of white. So that means that we have some area here that's really white. Now, what this allows us to do is that we can change how much black or how much gray or where this at. So basically we can work with the gamma, and we can also do it on each of the channels. So we could do it overall for the whole picture, or we could just select to the red and we can adjust just the red, we can adjust just the green, and we can adjust the blue. So each of those different channels, and you can see how much information is in different. Now the one thing you want to keep in mind is that if we change any of the single channels by themselves, it actually changes the color dynamics, right? Because it's changing just that type of color, so the information in that color. So in general, you can get some really cool effects with that, you know, kind of tweaking those individual channels. But overall picture quality, you probably want to work on the RGB channels. Okay, so now we can select this. A lot of times what you'll do is you'll find a picture or a piece of information that doesn't have very much white over on this edge, and you might see a big, it might be 0 all the way down here, and then it might spike up and go down. And what we can do is we can grab this little triangle, click and hold it down, and we can drag it over. And you notice how we're dragging it over. It's doing very similar things to the brightness and contrast, but we have much more control over how that's changing the picture. Okay? So if I wanted a little bit lighter, I could do that. I can also, and what it's doing is it's saying at what gradient, at what point am I determining what's black. So let's say we had 256 levels, okay? 0 being black and 256 being white. So what I can say, what I'm doing here when I move, let's say this black level over to here, I'm saying I don't want you to consider 0 black anymore. I want you to consider 39 black. So anything that has 39 or over, make it black. Okay, so it's compressing that dynamic range. So it's basically a much more refined brightness and contrast tool. And then this middle one is gamma. Okay, and so gamma is the overall balance of basically where that 50% gray point is going to be considered. And you can change that to also. So if I move it down that 50% gray point, I can really start to adjust how this image starts to take on a quality level. Okay. So that is basically the trick here. The same thing happens down here, is basically saying, okay, I want black to no longer be 0, but I'm making it 64, 74, and so it washes out the picture, which is similar to what contrast does, right, when we turn down the contrast. Okay, so let's close that one out. And another very critical one, so we're going down to the bottom again and selecting another layer, and we're going to do curves this time. So notice that it's showing us the histogram down here as well. But the curves allow us to do a little bit more fine tuning because we could start to tweak this. So oftentimes I'll start by clicking and holding in the center, and this creates a dot. Now I can pull and move this, and then you can start to see how I can start to adjust this. What's great about this is that I can really fine tune this. So I can put a dot here, and then I can put another dot there, and I can really start to get this to have a feeling that I want to. And then I can grab this end if I would like. So this is a way to really fine-tune and adjust. Usually what you're going to do is you will use the levels to create these black and white points so that these don't necessarily change. And then often I will use the levels to, so when we're here, I'm using this level to kind of adjust my basic presets, and then I use the curves to come in and fine-tune that middle area, the gamma area, to get that nice and clean. And it just takes some experimentation. So you just, anytime you get an image, just kind of jump into these and mess around and see what happens, and you'll start to get a feel for how this can improve your pictures. But mostly what you're trying to do is improve the contrast on a little washed out picture, or to pop the saturation a little bit so that it reads a little bit stronger and better. And then one other one that we're going to do is hue and saturation, because this is also another one that is helpful, that comes around quite a bit. So hue and saturation, what it allows us to do is to change the overall color balance of the image. So I can drag this over, and it basically changes the it shifts the color palette based on where I was. So if I'm at 0, there's no shift, but I'm shifting it toward blue as I move this direction, and green. And you can do some really crazy things with that. The other thing that is really helpful with this is the saturation. So I can really pop the saturation if I really want to and make it really crazy. Or sometimes the image is a little bit too saturated and I want a cooler, colder feel, so I might actually pop down the saturation by dragging it down. And there's some different presets that you can go. You can also, again, look at individual colors. You can adjust just the reds, the yellows, cyans, all of those. And it has some different presets. So one of these presets is sepia, which is one where it starts to break down the saturation and shift the hue over for a black and white. So we'll go back to default. So that can be very helpful to developing. And then the other one that I use quite often, because I'm a big fan of black and white, so I just was down here and chose black and white as a filter. So what's great about this black and white filter is that you can control how much effect, what gets dark. So I can choose to shift these reds, and you can see where the red pieces of the image, I can make those darker or lighter. So I can selectively come in and adjust these pieces. Again, we have these blues. So sometimes you can pop the it's really nice to pop the blues down and make the sky, quite a bit darker. And then it has some defaults. Now this is all, again, coming from photography, so if you are ever done photography, we can use a couple of different filters to have presets. So a red filter will do pretty much what I've done. It will lighten the red and it will darken the sky, which are any of the blues. It will fake an infrared. I don't know if you guys have ever seen those infrared pictures that the foliage becomes almost white and glowing. This will kind of fake it. Basically what it's doing is just shifting the greens and around a little bit and the reds. But I think it's kind of hokey. Neutral density. So you can go through these different pieces, but what I generally do is just use either the red filter, or I'll just come in and grab some of this blue and drop it down so that the sky becomes really nice and dark, and then you can kind of twist around. And if you start to use these in conjunction, what's great is, okay, so I've got this, I have that. So if I want a black and white version, I can do that. If I don't, I just turn it off. I can change the order in which these things happen. So sometimes the order in which these layers happen can change the overall outcome of how you put these together. So with that, questions? Yes? Yeah. So what you can do is you can come over here, let's say, for instance, this is our layer copy here, and I can do, let's say, do like a magic wand tool, and then invert it. Select, inverse. So now I just have this piece here, and it's selected. Now if I have that selected and I have that there, and then I put on, let's do a hue saturation. See, now it becomes locked into just that layer. So now I can just selectively go into here and say, desaturate just that piece. Yes? That's a possibility. Yeah. Yeah, so that's the trick. Is what I try to do is do it in such a way that it's non-destructive, that I can always go back and change it. Because what happens is, you'll do a certain aesthetic for a project, let's say, and then when you start to put together your portfolio, it's like 2 years later, right? You're like going, I'm kind of out of that mode, and I want to start to create a better cohesion. This will allow you to go back and kind of tweak these things without having to start from fresh, right? So that's where my preference. And I was going to get into this in a couple of weeks, a few weeks on this layer masking, this technique that I just used, because that can be super, super helpful to just have masks that have these just related to that specific layer. Because it will allow you to mask out certain elements. So especially if you're doing a simple rendering and then adding materials, you can just select these edges, and then you can move, and so the material and the texture behind it is like way bigger, right? But you're only cropping out just this little portion, and that just for that little piece. So that becomes super helpful. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But other questions? Yeah.
Similar to the boat, I was wondering the issues that are too small.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if for the size of this project, what's a good minimum to go through?
For this, I would say that for the texture images, you want to keep around 1500 pixels on the smallest side overall. And I think that went at 300 dpi on this one, so I think this is close to yeah, 2550 by 3000. I generally, personally, I try to keep in that 3000 pixel range as my smallest pixel size. That way I have much more flexibility on whether I'm using it for a big project or a small project. It's a little big, but the thing is, when you're creating these images, you can never go bigger. So you want to kind of create the biggest reasonable image that you can, and then go from there. Okay? Other questions? Yes?
So on this project, you took 4 of the different sections you did.
You pick, let me bring that up again. So I'm looking at the same thing. Okay, so when you were saying 4 of these things, what do you mean? No, you research all of those. Yes. Yeah. So the idea is that you, whenever there's a, and I'll try to be very explicit that you only have to pick one. But no, to understand this project, you need to understand all of these facets of it. So I want you to go in and learn about each of those. It's not like you have to write a report. It's just you need to look at each of those to do the project well and to inspire you to make connections and try to understand what they were trying to do when they were designing it. Because those are the same things they looked at. Right? They're from Norway, they're part of that culture. And then whenever you get into designing a project, the site is so huge. So the national park, you need to learn about the geology, you need to learn about why is the terrain the way it is, and what kind of geology, why is there rocks the way they are, why do certain plants. Now, I'm not asking you to go into that kind of detail here for this project, but I want you to learn about why they made it a national park. What was the big deal about it? Obviously, when we make a national park, like Yellowstone, it's because of the interaction between the geotechnical magma chambers and why it gets us geysers and all this other stuff. But it also creates a pretty amazing landscape, but it also has lots of diversity as far as animals and wildlife. So in the same way, they have a national park for a reason. So find out why. And why do they have a wild reindeer ceremony? And what does reindeer have to do with the Norwegian culture? So that make those kind of connections, and then that will that'll allow you to figure out how you want to, like I was doing, making that connection between how do we go from wood to carving and what carving means to the culture. Those are the kind of things I was trying to express, and we did it really quick. But does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
On the deliverables there, you have listed as 3,000 pictures by 1,800,
Mm-hmm.
and the actual file, you didn't have to have 11 different.
Yeah, what we've been working on here is kind of a test run so that you can learn the techniques and that. And but that is the pixel size that we want. Okay? Yes?
When you store like the actual collage for the lines,
Mm-hmm.
it's supposed to be like a smooth activity.
Well, again, it's a collage thing. So to me, that means that you should have the identity of these individual parts coming together to make a whole. So I'm not going to say that you can't do a full bleed, but generally I think you start to lose that part-to-whole relationship, that you start to lose the idea of collage when you go all the way to the edges. But as in any art, it's very hard to say there's a right way and a wrong way to do something. So use your aesthetic sense, and if you have a vision for it, push it and prove to me. But make sure that the thing that I say is the important, which is the idea of understanding and being able to read it as parts to wholes, still is there. Okay? Yes?
How do you want us to cite the images that are used?
What I'd like you to do is when you upload them, we'll put the, I want you to create a little text file with that site so that you're citing the images. Okay? Again, using the same kind of naming format, it'd be your last name, first initial, project, and then it'd be just a text file that says citations.
And do we have to use the format for those, or just probably those?
Use Chicago format, Chicago manual style. Other questions? Okay, so that's it for today. Enjoy your weekend, get some work on this done, and we'll see you on Monday.